Alert Media.
Welcome to Dread Alert. I'm Vince. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we are joined by Stephen Graham Jones, the Shirley Jackson and Bram Stoker award-winning author of 35 plus books and over 350 stories. Stephen has a PhD and teaches at the University of Colorado. He's also a New York Times bestselling author, and we are so grateful to have him with us today.
Man, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's certainly our pleasure. So today we're talking a little bit about your upcoming book, The Buffalo Hunter Hunter, which I just got through thanks to Simon and Schuster and to NetGalley for the advanced copy. I really, really enjoyed this book. I think it was distinctly different than some of the other stuff you've written lately, and I was just pleasantly surprised with the entire thing. After slashers and werewolves and zombies, what made you decide to take the leap and take on a vampire story?
Well, I hadn't had the nerve for it for a long time because there's so many amazing vampire novels that I thought, how can I make shoulder room? How can I do something that will be interesting to the readers? And finally, after teaching a graduate seminar on the vampire, I felt like I was stocked enough with the history, the literary tradition, the monster, the specifics of this type of vampire for this story, that type of vampire for that story, that I thought I could take a running start at it anyways. I didn't know if it'd go the whole distance, but luckily it came together.
I think you crossed the finish line just fine. I was
Thank you.
enthralled the entire way. And I think there's
Mhm.
so much detailed world building, and this creature is different in its mechanics than vampires I've seen in the past.
Mhm.
How hard of a line was that to walk, explaining what the creatures are and what they can do, and not giving away too much about the backstory and how they
That
work?
that was kind of you're asking about what were the impediments to me writing a vampire story, or that's kind of part of it anyways. And one of the big impediments for me was how can I design a creature that I can invest in, like emotionally, intellectually, that makes sense to me. That's what's most important to me for whatever I'm writing about, is that it makes sense to me, that it's
Mm.
the kind of real that I can believe in. And if I can believe in it, then I can probably get the reader to believe in it if I do things just right. And I don't always do things just right. Sometimes I get lucky, but I knew that for me to write a vampire, I had to disallow myself a lot of the conventional vampire characteristics. I knew that I could not be trusted with charming, or glamoring somebody, because my vampire would use that wildly indiscriminately. He'd use it like Nadia and Nandor on What We Do in the Shadows. You know, to make the whole stadium forget they tripped on some stairs or whatever, and so I can't be trusted with charming, and I definitely can't be trusted with flying, and because I can't explain flying. Flying doesn't make sense to me. Like I read Tomb of Dracula and he just jumps up and goes, and that just blows me away. And there wouldn't be any transformations either, any bats or wolves, because to me that's the territory of the werewolf more. I don't. I feel like the vampire over the centuries, with all the many, many, many wonderful tellings of its story, has kind of accumulated a lot of characteristics that started out as dramatic conveniences, and
Mm.
um, and they became codified into the DNA and then used without like being interrogated. And I wanted to interrogate them all. And yeah, my vampire is different. I mean, I don't think this spoils it too much. When my vampire starts feeding on something, it can't stop until there's nothing left. Because I don't that idea that a vampire can go to six different people in a single night and take a sip from each of them and rub saliva on their holes so they don't know they've been fed upon, and charm them into whatever. That to me seems like they're getting off too easy. That I think they should have to deal with the guilt of sucking this person dry and leaving a husk behind. And
I think that's really interesting because that's something that stood out to me both in I Was a Teenage Slasher and here
Mhm.
was the guilt that all of these characters are struggling with. And that's something
Yeah.
that really anchored it into the believability that I think you were shooting for.
Oh, thank you so much. And I wonder, like Noel Carroll, the guy who wrote Philosophy of Horror, he has these categories of monsters, and one of his types of monsters is a fusion monster, which is two things pressed together, like life and death, that result in a zombie. And to me, core at the very like central dynamo of a monster is I've got to do this terrible thing. I've got to feed on people, but like Louis in Interview with the Vampire, I don't want to. I feel guilty about it. And those two things ball together in a way that becomes like like the what do they call it? The gravity drive in Event Horizon. Like this weird thing that distorts everything around it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I come from a performance background as an actor,
Hmm.
and as an actor, we're always trying to find that vacillation between what do we want and
Hmm.
maybe wanting the other opposite thing, and that's
Yeah.
what really gives texture to the performance.
Oh,
It,
like who is it? I was talking to Ryder Strong once, the actor Ryder Strong, and he said that the an actor's absolute favorite character direction, like actors don't like character direction in the first place, but the one that they like is when it says, John, that's a character, and the dialogue is yes, that's all you have to say is yes, but the character direction is no. And that kind of friction, that's where a person can bring a whole universe alive.
Absolutely, and yeah, it really anchors it in the grounded believability of
Mm-hmm.
the character and the story,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we do extremely well with this book. It's so
Oh, thank
good.
you. Thank you.
Um, you mentioned in your acknowledgments, which for everyone watching, if you haven't read the acknowledgments to these novels, they are full of little bits of wisdom and horror history. I cannot recommend going all the way to the completion, the last page of these books, because I oftentimes find little things that I take with me about maybe not yanking a child's arm too hard or standing up for someone whenever you see that happen in public. That like lives in me. I'm grateful for
Yeah.
the wisdom. But you mentioned that every vampire story is a time travel tale, which I thought was the most clever way to frame it. How hard did you find it to find the voices of Good Stab and Three Persons? I had to look up so many words in the journal entries. How
Mhm.
hard was it to find their voices?
Well, yeah, a lot of those words that you might have tried to look up probably don't exist in the dictionary because Arthur Beaucarn, no, yeah, Beaucarn, the Lutheran pastor in 1912, who's recording Good Stab, the Blackfeet vampire story, he was educated in the Victorian era, of course, educated very well, but at the same time, he's kind of got that Lovecraft thing where he tries to show off with the depth and breadth of his command of language, and in his isolation, that's resulted in him not remembering all of the word and kind of making different words from partial stubs and all that stuff. And that his voice is so easy for me to do. I've written his voice two times before, once in a novel called Leadfeather, once in a story called Captain's Lament. And that is my most natural voice to write in. I would do all my stuff in that voice if I could, but I don't think people will tolerate that. Good Stab was a lot trickier. To get his voice and his diction and his delivery method down, I had to really read closely and take a lot of notes on James Welch's novel Fool's Crow, which is told in a very similar fashion. So James Welch did it first. I'm just like diluted James Welch.
One of the challenging, but I think really clever things you did with Good Stab was to not over explain some
Hmm.
of the cultural phrases for things. I
Hmm.
found myself having to lean forward a little bit more, almost in like a David Foster Wallace active reading sort of way. And then as
Hmm.
the story progresses, we start to get clues that, oh, that's an antelope. Oh,
Hmm.
that's a rabbit. I found that to
Hmm.
be extremely challenging, but also in a very positive way.
Oh, that's exactly the experience I want for the reader. So I'm so glad to hear that it happened at least once. That makes me happy. But yeah, like when you go back to and you read Morning Dove from Zitkala Shah in 1905, she's telling kind of a well, she's telling a novel, but there's all these like cultural reference that have I think it's footnotes and what that does is that orients the text for a non-native audience and for a long time that was the default setting for native lit that this is not for us, this is to expose us to y'all, so we have to explain it. And I think that I'm not saying it waters the text down. I don't want to speak bad about Morning Dove, but I'm more interested in texts that make the reader have to step over the line and try to see things from my shoes, from my point of view. And that's the magic of reading, I think, actually. It works out your empathy muscles. So, but you're right. It was a fine line to walk because, like Lindsay Marmon Sokol says of her novel Ceremony from what 77 or something. It's a 300, maybe it's a 320 page novel. She says, were I telling this to a Pueblo audience, which is the culture she's from, it'd be 30 pages long because I wouldn't have to explain these things. But so it's a really fine line between, I don't want to be too obscure because at a certain point, the obscurity becomes like exoticism and you're selling that, and I don't want to do that, of course. So it's fraught with dangers and pitfalls and it's just like a tight wire act.
It worked for someone with a genuine interest in the culture and
Mhm.
also someone who's willing to put in the effort to actively read. I think that pushing through that challenge, it was
Mm,
rewarding, but also, I don't know, made the book more authentic to me as well, without being
thank you.
overly
Mm.
complex. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know what I was terrified of, and I think I say this in the acknowledgments, is you know, I used to read and read Percival Everett's novel Erasure, and he has that like little embedded novella in there called My Pathology, where this really erudite black writer adopts like a kind of a ghetto street language to tell this crime story kind of thing, and that book, that little novella, becomes a worldwide sensation because it's authentic, it's exotic, it's the voice of the people, all that stuff. And it's, I mean, it was made in that movie American Fiction, which he does it very well. And I was so afraid that me doing Goodstab's voice and that kind of diction that he's using, it's not quite red English, but it's probably on the spectrum towards that. I was afraid that I was doing my pathology, and so that was another like hard balancing act. Like, how do I do this without irony? Because Good Stuff's not gonna. He does have irony, but it's not about that, you know.
Yeah.
Hmm.
100%.
Hmm.
I think that both of these characters were very skilled with rhetoric, as
Hmm.
said early in the novel. It was interesting to watch them both. It was like 3D chess, or just
Hmm.
dark manipulation in some ways. I was surprised to see that out of a pastor, out of three persons, so
Yeah,
clearly.
yeah,
Very
yeah.
compelling.
Yeah, I mean, he was trained in all the like the Greek philosophers and stuff. That would have been like de rigueur for him learning in 1860s at what would become Yale, I guess. And so he has all those rhetorical strategies in his head, and I feel like he hasn't had to activate them for about 4 decades. And so when Goodstep comes in and starts poking him and prodding him at the edge of his like happy existence, or his not happy existence, but he's kind of washed up on the far shore of his life, and he has found peace with everything he's done, more or less. But it's not over yet, man.
Thematically, one line that really stood out to me in the
Mhm.
novel, and there are a number of themes at play,
Mhm.
but the one that jumped out to me is, what I am is the Indian who can't die. I'm the worst dream America ever had. It
Mhm.
feels like this is the story of generational inheritance as well as generational trauma,
Yeah.
and the story of the persistence of First Nations people, even when the country tried to erase them. What do you want the reader to leave with? Am I on the right track?
I guess what I want them to leave with is a sense of a whole culture's like outrage. I don't want people feeling sorry for us. I don't think that helps anything. But I want them to understand that people standing at podiums and saying, "We're sorry, we stole your land and killed your people," isn't good enough. That doesn't do nothing. We like apologies to indigenous people. We understand its hollowness because there's no action that follows it. And so I guess I would hope if they leave with anything from this novel, it's a sense that um, there's more to be done, or
Mm.
or what's been done has not been sufficient. Anyways.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
think that's really evident in the
Mhm.
sort of pre-climax, one of those final journal entries. I think
Mhm.
that's exposed pretty well. Pretty well.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
honestly, there are points in the story where I don't know who I should be rooting for.
Yeah,
Sometimes I'm rooting for
yeah.
Arthur. Sometimes I'm rooting for Full Blood. Sometimes I'm rooting for Take No Scalps. And in some ways, some of those characters may be the same person at some points. And so, I think that you really play with that vacillation and that
Mhm.
dichotomy. The yes when you're playing no. It really is. It
Oh,
really
thank
is
you.
interesting to go through.
That's one of the most fun things for me to do in a story is to kind of manipulate or modulate reader alliance. Maybe that's
Mm.
what to call it. Like, yes, I believe in that person, but oh no, they did that terrible thing, and that to me is endless fun, and it's also to me the real world.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
No, I don't think we're one-sided creatures by any
yeah,
means. I know I'm not.
yeah.
How realistic is the wraparound story in terms of academia? I know that you're
Mm.
involved in
Mm.
that world, and
Yeah.
in another life, I probably would have been myself. I was
Mm.
an English and education major for a whole semester
Mm.
before I went into performing arts.
Mm.
Is it more of a thematic uh, function? Is it more thematic, or is it more functional in delivering closure to the story that otherwise wouldn't have any closure or couldn't have any closure?
I did consider what would this novel look like without Etsy Bokarn's like bookends,
Mm.
and to me, it's an incomplete story if we don't have her to finish it. Because you're right, it is about is the guilt passed on? Who, like, I think a lot of people in America right now, they're like, yeah, like Sheridan and Sherman and those generals back in the 19th century, they were terrible, but we're okay. We don't have to pay for any of their sins. Any of the bad, like Custer, yeah, Custer was terrible, but we're not Custer. But they're doing the same things Custer was doing, and so yeah, it'd be nice if people would cue into that.
Yeah, we as you say in the novel, we put up our fences, but it
Yeah,
doesn't mean we
yeah,
own the land for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Um, it's interesting. I think also without the bookends, you might fall
Hmm.
into what I call the found footage problem, which is we stop hard and never
Hmm.
get that resolution
Hmm.
functionally or thematically. So
Yeah, yeah. And
I was very pleased when I got to part two and realized I still had like 2.5 hours left in the novel. I was like, this is great.
oh, thank you. I'm so glad that thrills me to no end. But yeah, without Etsy's closing like segment, without that part two, to me, the story just doesn't end. You're right. It's like a weird artifact that has no closure.
Mm. Yeah. I'm going off script for my list of questions,
Hmm.
but this is just out of curiosity, personally
Hmm.
speaking. Goodstab tells a lot of stories from his youth.
Hmm.
How how did you come up with these? Are these creations that you had created, or these things that you had heard elsewhere? I'm just curious about the sort of historicity of the stories.
Yeah, that's a good word, historicity, because the stuff he talks about, like signing a treaty or getting baptized in a river, and when the smallpox epidemics came, all that stuff is hard. That's like you can find that in the books. That's stuff that really happened. But the stories specifically about his youth, those are made up. Those are just things I dreamed up, and I probably dreamed them up from. I mean, it's a terrible place to get it, but I probably dreamed it up from reading a lot of Louis L'Amour when I was 10 and 11 years old, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, they ring true and authentic. Even the dealings with Napi and all this stuff. I just
Mm-hmm.
it was all very very authentic
Oh,
to
thank
me.
you.
And again,
Thank you.
I'm a layman at best when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to indigenous studies, but
Hmm.
I have a strong interest, and so yeah, it
Thank
was
you.
very fulfilling.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I,
Yeah,
I'm
well, that Nappy part, I did feel like I'm playing with fire here. I could get in trouble if I mess this up?
Yeah, it definitely. This whole
Yeah.
book is walking fine lines. I can't
Hmm.
imagine how many tightropes you were going
Yeah.
across when you were
Yeah.
writing it.
Yeah. But I mean, I think tightropes, that's what you got to do as an artist. If you're not walking a tightrope, what are you even in it for?
Yeah, it's all about risk,
Hmm.
and you know, I've taken my fair share of bad risks, but I've also
Yeah.
taken some really good risks as an artist, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so rewarding.
It is. It is. I mean, if you don't make yourself vulnerable, I don't think you're doing art?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so spot on. It's all about vulnerability,
Hmm.
especially as a performer. You're exactly right.
Hmm.
Okay, I have two final questions for
Sure.
you. You mentioned The Lesser Dead as one of the best vampire novels, which I've
Hmm.
added to my list to read because I've not read it yet.
Hmm.
What is your favorite vampire film?
Near Dark in
Near Dark. Good
1987.
choice.
Yeah, Near
Yeah,
Dark. Live. I love Near Dark, and I love how stripped down the vampire is in Near Dark. Like they don't even have sharp teeth,
yeah,
and they definitely don't have investment portfolios. They don't wear capes. They're just grubby. They live in their cars with blacked out windows, and every night is another survival night. If we don't eat, we die, and that
yeah.
I just really love all the pressures and just the build of the vampires in Near Dark.
Awesome. Well, we'll try and bring you a quick review of that on the channel as well, since we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about it here today.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, I know you write for Fangoria. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
subscriber. I look forward to Slasher Nation every
Thank
month.
you.
We try and incorporate some of these things because there's Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic book. There's Slasher Nation, but there's not a ton of academia surrounding
Mm-hmm.
the structure of slashers, and I think that you've done a really great job theorizing and solidifying some of this stuff.
Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you.
what is your favorite slasher film?
Oh, it's Scream. And
Scream.
I mean, part of it is I love just how solid of a film this was Wes Craven at the height of everything he could do, and he could do a lot. And it had the fortunate writing of Kevin Williamson, the
Yeah,
newcomer on the scene, just blasting like a comet into the world, and changing everything forevermore. But it's funny because people always they say Scream um, introduced meta to slashers to horror, and maybe it did, but I don't think Scream's intent was not meta. Scream's intent was to pull the slasher into the real world, but in the mid '90s, that meant pop-up video. That meant David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest with all these footnotes. Everything had like was a intertextual with everything else, and that's what Scream did. It it by pulling the slasher kicking and screaming into our world, dragging behind it this long tail of video rentals off the horror shelves at whatever video store, um, it made it real and it made it scarier. It made it something that could happen to us. Because when, like in Friday the 13th 9, Jason Goes to Hell, when there's that slasher response team, that SWAT team that takes Jason down, that we realize, oh, this is divorced from us. This isn't a side world because that doesn't happen over here. That happens over there, and that's not as scary. But I think Scream had real scare potential by having the same tale of not video game, VHS rentals behind it that we did. That
Yeah.
was beautiful and amazing.
I think your analysis of Scream is pretty spot on.
Mm.
It sort of is atonement for making Laurie Strode Michael's sister. It brings it back to it can happen anywhere at any time.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
the
yeah,
penance, as it were, the
yeah.
the absolution. Since we're talking about the Buffalo Hunter.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I can't thank
Mm.
you enough. I hope that if you're watching, you enjoyed this. I hope you pick up a copy. It's out on March 18th, and I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. I can easily see it on my top 5 list for the year. And as
Thank you, man.
always, stay spooky, my friends.